This is The Raid, exposing the dark world of America's deportation machine. I'm your host, John Carlos Frey. On the podcast today are two reporters from the Marshall Project, Anna Flagg and Shannon Heffernan. Anna is a journalist working in the field of data. She's worked on stories for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, ProPublica, Politico, The Guardian, the Associated Press, Al Jazeera, and other news outlets. Shannon focuses on prisons and jails across the U.S. She's also interested in reporting on sex and gender-based violence, immigration, and mental health care. Her reporting can be heard on national radio shows including This American Life and NPR's Morning Edition. The Marshall Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit news organization that seeks to sustain a sense of national urgency about the U.S. criminal justice system. Both reporters are on the podcast to talk about a recent article they wrote entitled, "Daily Number of Kids in ICE Detention Jumps 6 Times Under Trump." Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. And I'm sorry to talk about what seems to be a very difficult topic for most of us, which is children being detained. The two of you both co-authored a recent article with the Marshall Project, and it speaks specifically to a rise or a spike in immigrant detention, primarily children in detention. And whichever of you want to start first, maybe you can give me a short summary of what the article is about, and maybe even start with a little bit of the reporting process. I know that you've written a prior article with similar subject matter. So how did this come about? And talk a little bit about the most recent.
Yeah, I think that we saw the changes in immigration enforcement that have been happening under Trump, and in particular, how there's been more enforcement in the interior of the country. And you can sort of predict that if that's where the priority is, then there's going to be more families and children being brought up into that enforcement. So we were interested in looking at how many families, how many children are experiencing this. We did a story in, I think it was December, just trying to count the number of kids that had been booked into ICE detention by the Trump administration. And then our most recent one looks at the daily populations of kids that are being held on an average day under Trump versus previously. And what we saw is that today, on average, about 170 kids are in ICE detention. And that's up 6-fold from what the number was under Biden in the last 16 months under Biden, where the number was around 25.
Did you want to add anything, Shannon?
No, I think from there, I think Anna did this terrific data work. And then we wanted to know, well, what's that like for them? What does that mean for them? So we reached out to lawyers and advocates who are in touch with families inside. We combed through court documents to understand what these detention conditions are like. And as many of your listeners probably already know, they're quite troubling, with medical issues with the food, and issues with the water. And then we felt like that was something that we really needed to share with the public.
So I want to sort of dissect this topic of children in detention. And Anna, you had sort of mentioned that there was a 6-fold increase in what was prior to that. So I just want to go back to maybe the Biden administration. I know that during Obama, there was some family detention as well. So what I guess I'm getting at is this idea to bring the child along with the parents. Typically, it's the parents who have some kind of an immigration violation, right? And they're bringing their entire family into detention. It's not that the kid necessarily has an immigration violation, although they may, right? So the whole family unit is being detained. Is that the right way to look at it?
Well, I was going to say yes and no in terms of the question of the whole family unit. You sometimes have mixed status families. You have families where just who happens to be there when they come and arrest people, and they're being separated. So I actually don't think it's all the time whole family units. Now, there aren't kids at Dilley who don't have a parent with them, but often it might be one parent while another parent is at home, or siblings are at home.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
So in that same vein, typically, at least under Biden, to not detain family members that included children, you would argue your immigration case or or go through the process of trying to get a normalized status or regularize your status at home. You would go to your court hearing, so you would not necessarily be put into some kind of a detention facility. That was prior to what we're seeing now. Is that the way that they handled it?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, it's completely possible and feasible to progress these cases while not being in detention. And I would say like a vast majority of the people in detention pose no sort of safety risk. And the reason for their detention, I don't know, it appears to be primarily to try to speed up their deportation and meet those deportation quotas that are being set by the administration. That seems to be the goal more than anything else, more than public safety or any other type of priority is what it appears.
I think it's really important to note that lots of the lawyers we spoke to for these families say their clients were arrested while they were actually showing up to court hearings, while they were showing up to check-ins. And these are, in many cases, people who have active asylum cases, for example, cases where if it were able to unfold in the courts, they have a valid potential to stay in the United States. So I think that is worth noting. These aren't necessarily like large groups of people that are trying to escape notice. A lot of them are showing up when and where they're told to show up.
I'm assuming there are no numbers of the violations of law that the individuals who do have children with them have committed. These are not, I'm trying to get it, these are not the worst of the worst, right? But we don't actually have percentages of moms and dads who are in detention with their kids, at least of their violations.
My understanding is that everybody at Dilley does not have a serious criminal record. If there's a serious criminal record, they're going to be detained at another facility and their children are going to have to stay at home with a family member or go into a care system. The people who are sent to Dilley are not people with serious violent records.
Why do the kids come with them? If the parents are the ones who were detained at an immigration hearing pleading their case and they got swept up in these strange courthouse raids that were happening, why won't the children stay with a guardian or a neighbor or something like that?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I think in some cases, the parents want to have the child with them. You've heard stories of people being afraid they're going to be separated from their child, sent home. And so keeping that contact with their child is important. In other cases, it might be an instance where they don't have other options. There might not be somebody else for them to safely stay with. And then in other cases, the government might be making that decision for them. They might be taking the child into detention with them. So I think that there's a lot of different ways that you might see that play out.
Right. Did we lose Anna? It looks like.
Possibly.
Hopefully she'll come back.
There's a lot. I can't speak for the government's motivation in these cases. But what we have heard from advocates is there's a lot of suspicion that the reason they're taking full families into detention is to serve as kind of a warning, to make it actually feel a little bit frightening. So people who are terrified of the idea of their child being in a detention center with them will just go ahead and choose to go back to the country they came from, even if they might have valid legal claims to stay here, because the idea that they might get arrested and detained with their child is so terrifying.
So you're using the children as some kind of a leverage?
I think that there's a lot of advocates who are very suspicious that the reason that they are doing this is to make a horrific situation serve as a warning sign to people.
It's my understanding, and I can look this up in my reference as well, that immigration detention itself is not supposed to be used as a deterrent. That is not the purpose. It's not supposed to be punitive. It is a measure by which people's cases are being adjudicated to see whether or not they can stay or whether or not they're going to leave. So this idea of being punitive, of putting pressure on you to deport yourself or threatening to remove you from children, all of that sort of stuff is in violation of the laws themselves. Is that how you see it?
I mean, I'd have to have a better understanding of the exact legal mechanisms, but in terms of how it violates the law. But I will say that like immigration detention is not supposed to be prison. It's not supposed to be jail. It's not supposed to be punitive. And the conditions we've heard about are very prison and jail-like. I report on prisons and jails, and the conditions I hear and there are very, very similar.
Anna, you deal with the data primarily, right, of the numbers and crunching the numbers. Is this typical to see a six-fold increase? Does this ebb and flow, or is this something out of the norm?
It's definitely out of the norm. I think that what we're seeing right now in terms of numbers of kids being brought in and the lengths of stay that they're serving inside these detention facilities is completely different from what has been the norm in recent memory. I think the idea of ICE taking kids into custody as any kind of deterrent or as any kind of punishment, I mean, that violates the idea of what immigration enforcement is supposed to be, even more so when it comes to kids, because ICE is really never supposed to take a child into custody. And if they do take a child into custody, under the Flores Agreement, there are provisions about how they're supposed to treat that child and how they're supposed to manage that child's holding that child. And they're supposed to release the child as soon as possible.
I have another document in front of me, Shannon, and I want to read. There's, as you're very well aware of, in 1997, there was the Flores Settlement Agreement, which was a landmark case that basically resulted in class action lawsuits that had been filed on behalf of immigrant minors. And because of that, there was a standard that was issued on how we treat children that are being incarcerated or being detained. It's not that necessarily is the teeth. There's no real law that has been passed by Congress that says you must do this, but this is the way that the Florence settlement basically mandates how you're supposed to treat children. And I just want to read a couple of them, and then maybe we can have a discussion based on your article of what you are actually seeing. So the agreement has a couple of different categories on how you're supposed to treat children. One is what's called a release priority. The government must release children from detention to parents, guardians, or other qualified custodians without unnecessary delay. That unnecessary delay would be within a 20-day period. Standards of care. Minors must be held in facilities that are state licensed and safe, providing proper food, water, medical care, and supervision. They're supposed to be placed in what they have in quotes, the least restrictive setting. Children should not be held in secure prison-like facilities. They must be placed in the least restrictive environment appropriate to their age and needs. Class counsel monitoring. The settlement also allows for legal monitoring where attorneys can inspect facilities and interview children to ensure compliance. And then the last sort of category, coverage. It applies to all minors in federal custody, including both unaccompanied children and those apprehended with parents. So all federal facilities must abide by these kinds of standards. So the question then is, if that's the standard based on the settlement agreement, what are we seeing? Do they match? Does that sound like what you're hearing from people and advocates?
Well, we know from the data that some of those aren't being met. We know that children are being held in excess of that 20-day limit. We also have heard from families that their medical needs aren't being met. You mentioned that. We heard about people who are getting delayed doctor's care, like a person who filed an affidavit about a declaration about an ear infection that went so far that they began to experience hearing loss. A child who had appendicitis that went untreated and they were writhing on the floor eventually did get the care that they needed. And you mentioned the food and the water. We hear reports of food that's infested with mold, with worms, reports of water that smells foul, that is undrinkable. So I would say that our reporting indicates if what people are telling us inside is true and what they've seen and the data we have says and how long they're being held, then that's not a match for what is in the Flores Agreement.
And how is that possible? I mean, you're talking about, just the list that you just stated feels inhumane to me. I mean, food with worms in it, no medical care, all of those things staying longer than 20 days. How is that possible? Is there not some sort of oversight or somebody monitoring the way that things are being managed?
So a lot of the oversight mechanisms that have previously existed have been really drawn back under the Trump administration. The Flores Agreement does still have some guardrails in it, and you have lawyers who, are filing in court to try to force the government to act and fix these problems. But simultaneously, you also have the government trying to get out from underneath this Flores agreement. They are arguing that they should no longer, that the circumstances have changed and they should no longer be guided by the Flores agreement. And that's honestly one of the last methods of oversight and one of the final guardrails that's in place.
One of the standards of the Flores agreement, too, were these sort of outside monitors. Members of Congress should be able to go in and inspect. The attorneys should be able to go in and make sure that their clients are being well cared for. That's not happening either, right?
Well, we have heard from Flores lawyers that they are going in and talking to families. And there was a representative, two representatives actually, who recently went into the Dilley facility. Is it happening as frequently as they would like, or to the degree that they would like? I actually don't know, but we do see some people getting inside to talk to families, yes.
In the article, you reference when you speak to actual individuals who are being detained, that their children are growing more depressed, that nobody should stay there more than those 20 days, that it's unbearable to begin with. Am I correct to assume that there are no real facilities for children? There's no school there. There's not a playground there. Those sorts of things that kids may engage in?
There is some schooling. We have heard from parents that it's inadequate. That it's basically filling out worksheets, that sometimes there's not enough slots, so not every kid can go in. And we've heard that there is not enough mental stimulation for the kids or enough recreation. There is a gym, but that there's just not enough for the number of kids there to be entertained and stimulated in the way that a child needs to be stimulated. If you've ever been around a child, they need a lot of input, right? And there were court declarations about children, so desperate for toys that they were playing with rocks. And children who were under such mental distress that children who were previously potty trained were now wetting themselves, or children were hitting themselves in the face because they were so psychologically distressed. I think that there's a lot of indications that these environments are quite stressful for adults, let alone children.
Do you know what the living situation is like for a family? Let's say, I think there's one group that you interviewed, a mother with 5 children, right? At Dilley, do they all stay in the same room? Is it like an apartment? How does that work?
So for that specific family, one of the children was actually 18 years old and was separated from the family, not on her 18th birthday, according to their family lawyer, but after she spoke to the press. And so that separation they viewed as a sort of punishment for speaking to the press. In terms of the living conditions of where they're sleeping, we've heard that lights are on for long stretches. It's crowded and noisy. If you've seen pictures of Dilley, it's sort of like these set up interconnected trailer situations. People walk outside to get between the different locations. So even the conditions of where you're living is not adequate for children as well, right? That's what we're hearing from folks, yes. And also, in terms of the separation, men are in a different location. Adult men are in a different location than adult women. So if you have a family that came in with 2 parents, the father usually would be in a different location at night. So there's some separation happening within the facility. But you also do have fathers who are there alone with the child, so they would be on the male side of the facility. This idea of detaining children, and Anna, if you want to answer it, that would be great if you can. This idea of detaining children, I noticed on the graph that you have, the graphic that you have on the article, and that sort of big red bar graph that you have of how many more children were being detained. But there's also another bar graph that I noticed on some statistics that I saw of children going past the 20 days in detention. Typically, you would see a spike when people were being released around 20 days, that children were being released around 20 days. That seemed to be something that was respected. It seems to be violated now that 20-day limit is going longer and longer. Can you talk a little bit about that?
They are supposed to release children as soon as possible once they have a child in their custody. And the 20 days is the limit for how long they ever should hold a child who's there together with a family. But really, they're supposed to release that child as soon as possible. So what you usually see when you look at the lengths of stay that children are staying is a peak around the 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, because that's when most of the kids are getting let out. But then what we saw under this most recent Trump administration is that there's this giant peak right around the 20 days and extending beyond. And what that suggests, according to experts that I showed the chart to, was that ICE is actually holding people and kids as long as they can, going right up to that 20-day limit and beyond in some cases, as a way to attempt to keep them as long as possible and deport people straight out of detention. Because as I think Shannon was mentioning, when someone's in detention, it's a lot harder to fight their case. It's harder to communicate with lawyers. They're also experiencing the conditions of detention, and they might be watching their child experience these really difficult conditions of detention.
So is that possible, that we are wearing the children down so that the parents can watch their children degrade and say, I can't take this anymore, I'm going to sign my voluntary departure? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of what you're saying.
I do think the conditions of detention have that effect on people. They might decide to leave the country just as a way of getting out of detention and getting their children out of detention.
And lastly, Anna, and I'll go back to Shannon, we have numbers of how many kids are being released around the 20 days or beyond that are held sort of past the time that they're supposed to? In the
data that we looked at towards the end of last year, we found at least 1,000 kids who had been detained longer than the 20-day limit.
It's kind of logical to think that if there is this mandate to release kids at around 20 days, that the facility is not equipped for children. Children are not flourishing here, right? 20 days is probably about the psychological limit for a kid in one of these spaces. So they're saying release them as quickly as you can because we're not equipped to handle children. This is not a daycare.
I mean, that's exactly the message we're hearing from a lot of the lawyers and advocates that we're talking to, that even short stays can be harmful, but especially long stays can be harmful for folks. And, in excess of 20 days for some of these families, they've been there several months and continue to be there. So some of the stays do get quite long.
I know that the federal government's policy for the most part when it comes to apprehending people is a detention first policy. Everybody goes through detention. Everybody gets incarcerated. It used to be that if you had an asylum case or you had no criminal record, that you could be remanded or you could wait your turn in trial or in an immigration court. But now everybody's getting pulled into detention, and it feels like children too. What's the problem, if you know, of allowing a mother and her young child to not endure the trauma of detention and stay at home and wait for her case to be adjudicated? Why isn't that happening? Why aren't a lot of people being released back out?
There are deportation quotas that the administration is asking for, right? So ICE is under pressure to deport as many people as possible. And I think the most efficient way to deport as many people as possible is to detain as many people as possible and deport them straight out of detention.
So if a mother and child didn't go through the detention process, they may stay home for months and months and fight their case. But if they're put into some kind of a prison setting, it would force them to sign a voluntary departure, something like that?
I don't know if I would say it would force them to sign a voluntary departure, even though, I think it would be fair to say that there would be a lot of pressure.
If I stay in a detention facility for months and months, as Shannon was saying, my life is going to get worse, and so is my child's life going to get worse. So it sort of forces my hand to sign that voluntary departure because I can't endure it anymore. It's like a process of attrition. It just gets harder and harder to stay.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's a very difficult choice. You're presenting people with an impossible choice.
Has any advocacy, any pressure, any lawsuit that's been filed on behalf of children and the detention facilities, the conditions within the detention facilities, has it forced the hand of these detention facilities? Has Dilley started to improve conditions? Do we know of any changes that are going on as a result of some of the light that you've brought to this subject?
I haven't heard anything that's happened since we released these stories, which is fairly recently. But Flores' lawsuit has gotten some responses from the facility pushing them to change things. Like supposedly they're starting a new education system. I don't know what the quality of that will be. And there have been some lawyers that have been successful at getting their clients released while their case unfolds.
What is it that someone can do? If I'm a family in detention, if I'm a mother with a few kids and I'm not being fed properly, or my child is degrading or needs medical attention, what recourse do I have? Is there a complaint system? Do I talk to my attorney? Is there somebody within the facility itself that's monitoring these kinds of complaints?
Honestly, I can't speak to the complaint system. I believe they do have one, but I don't know it well enough to speak to it well. So forgive me for that. People can go to their attorneys, or they can go to the Flores lawyers. The Flores lawyers are responsible for all kids in detention to represent them. So they keep an eye on broader conditions.
What is happening to the Trump administration for violating the length of stay for children, going past 20 days, 1,000 kids that have gone up to 20 days and beyond? Is this what the lawsuit is about, or is there pressure on them to abide by the Flores settlement?
I mean, certainly the Flores lawyers have been pushing them to abide by the conditions of the lawsuit. I mean, they've been putting in filings, trying to get them to comply. And at the same time, the Trump administration is trying to get removed from that source of oversight. So that's playing out in the courts right now.
We are in the beginning of an expansion. I understand that they're going to want to detain over 100,000 undocumented immigrants, or to deport, or, to hold. I don't see this situation getting any better. Is there any anecdotal evidence or even direct evidence of what happens to individuals when they get out? Is there any sort of trauma-based studies or psychological studies of what happens to a kid?
Yeah, we've been in touch with lawyers who say that kids experience psychological distress. Their clients have continued to experience psychological distress for weeks and months after their releases. I mean, I think that it makes logical sense that a family who's in that situation is going to have repercussions for that. I've not heard about this directly, but do keep in mind, a lot of the people who you're seeing in these cases aren't people who just recently crossed the border. They're people who've been in the country for months or years. They have jobs, they have communities. If you're away from a job for 2 months, there's going to be a question on if you have a job to return to. So one thing that I would like to explore more in our reporting is, what are the financial repercussions for some of these families who've been in detention for stretches? What does it look like when they get released, in terms of how did that disrupt their life and their ability to support their families?
I think there's a pretty big body of research looking at how kids are affected after interacting with the immigration system. And that includes even something like witnessing a family member get arrested. So, you can imagine if something like that is going to have traumatic effects that last for years, what kind of effects are going to happen to a kid that actually is also detained for many days or weeks inside a facility and has that uncertainty of not knowing if they're going to get home, when they're going to get home, what's going to happen to their parents, what's going to happen to their other members of their family that might not have authorization. I mean, you can imagine, and it stands to reason that there's going to be considerable trauma.
I would imagine that it wears on people that you'd want to learn or adjust to treat kids fairly and justly and humanely, that you'd want to create a facility where kids are safe. This idea that keeping them beyond the limit and depriving them of food and water and medication seems barbaric at the very least. Is this, the question is this, I know we've talked about it a little bit, but is this on purpose, or is this because they're inept?
I mean, I don't know if we can know. Core Civic, I want to be clear about this separate thing. Like when people get released, that's a decision of the federal government. The conditions would be the federal government and Core Civic. And I should say here that Core Civic, in their statements to us, they did not answer our specific questions about specific allegations from folks, but they did say generally that they work to take care of the people in their care and they provide proper medical care and all that. But, without proper oversight, it's really hard for them to prove that up, especially considering some of the information that we're getting out.
Shannon, I read the quote back that you guys wrote verbatim from Core Civic. It makes it sound like Disneyland. We make sure that everybody gets adequate care and everybody is happy and safe and sound and plenty of food and water. I mean, it makes it sound idyllic. but people on the ground have this opposite. So they're either lying about it, or the individuals who are being incarcerated are lying about it. Somebody's not telling the truth here, it seems like.
Yeah, or their perceptions of what people are deserving of might be different.
But that goes to my editorializing about how can you possibly treat children this way?
I think that's an important question.
But how do you two feel as, I don't mean to be sexist, but as women, I don't know if you have children. I mean, does this affect you when you do a report like this? I want a response from both of you if you're willing to answer.
I mean, I think no matter what your beliefs are politically, when you hear about a child in medical distress or psychological distress, that is troubling. And I am a mother. And when I come home with my child, yes, it's something that I continue to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think if you are a parent or you're close to a child and you're seeing evidence of children being mistreated or being put in these really wrong conditions, it's kind of impossible not to think about that a lot and bring it home with you a little bit. I mean, I guess one thing that kind of has struck me through reporting this is that when President Trump was campaigning, he talked a lot about immigrants being criminals, which we know, of course, is not true. But a bunch of his campaign was about creating this false link between immigration and crime. And so, what a disconnect now that you can see when on the ground, what's happening is that children are being locked up. I mean, we know children are innocent. Like even if you believe that immigrants are criminals, which they're not, but even if you believed that, you certainly don't believe that children are in any way not innocent. So there's just a giant disconnect here, I think, between this idea of cracking down on immigration as a way to reduce crime. And for anybody who cares about solving those problems, it's just so clear that it's not going to work and it's hurting so many people in the process.
As a matter of fact, one of the families that you feature in the most recent article that was published in January features a family of 5 who are fighting the fact that they're being incarcerated or detained for absolutely no reason at all, that they're being accused of something that they didn't do. So either one of you, if you want to just tell me a little about that story.
It was a violent attack, and that man is in custody, and this is his family, and they believe that they're being targeted with these immigration proceedings specifically because of their relationship to him, despite them saying they knew nothing of the attack, despite federal agents saying that they did not believe they had any knowledge of the attack, and that family has been there for months, including 2 5-year-old twins.
There's a pair of twins at 5 years old. There's an 18-year-old girl who's been separated from the group of her family. She's been isolated from her family. And the article, I believe, says 8 months, and they have not been charged with a crime, correct?
No.
So they haven't even been charged with a crime, and the entire family unit is being held without really knowing why, and they believe that they're innocent. So detention facilities are not criminal holding places. They're not jails where people go who have committed crimes. These are places where people are sort of in transit, whether or not they're going to stay in the U.S. or be deported. So why are they being held for so long? Do we know?
They have absolutely no connection that has been proven up in terms of them knowing anything about the attack or participating in any degree. I mean, some of them are 5-year-olds.
Well, I would imagine that they would have been charged with a crime if there was evidence, right? There would be some criminal court proceedings if they had been charged with a crime. Last little bit of subject matter, if we can go through this idea that was a recurring theme, maybe because I'm a journalist and I kept reading the same thing over and over again. You went for response from the facility, the company that runs the facility, and they suggested that you go to ICE for any answer to any questions that you may have about the way the facility was being managed, and ICE never responded. A federal agency, a government agency, a taxpayer-funded agency, you're journalists, you have every right to ask questions. do they not have a responsibility to respond? If you're asking about conditions or this particular event or this particular person, do they not have a public facing PR person or a press person there that's supposed to respond?
I mean, my opinion as a journalist is that federal agencies funded by taxpayer dollars are beholden to share information with the public, and that we have routinely asked the government for information about immigration detention at Dilley and other places too. And we usually have gotten no response or gotten boilerplate sort of responses that don't reveal information to us. And I do find that very troubling. It's the same way I find oversight troubling. I think that abuse flourishes in places that we cannot see into. And I think that these places are very hard to see into right now.
Anna, did you get any no's or just no responses for any information that you were requesting?
I mean, I think it's mostly been pretty boilerplate. Like, I've gotten a couple statements along the lines of, ICE does not separate children from parents. ICE does not use children as leverage, statements like that. And I've also seen those exactly same worded statements reported by other news outlets. So I think it's just pretty standard statements that they have prepared to give journalists that are not really giving us any real information.
So the reason for asking the question is because I'm assuming that the deep dive investigative work that you two have been doing, and thank you for exposing what you have been exposing, and I assume there will be a series of articles here because you're not going to stop. But part of this is to hold the government to account. You let the public know about these shocking details about how children are being taken care of or not taken care of, and that we have this alarming spike in how many children are being detained. But the government is non-responsive, and the government appears to be non-reactive. It doesn't seem to be moving the needle at all. At least the reporting used to be, if you did something like this, that the government would respond quickly because it doesn't want to be found out, the fourth rail that we're supposed to be. Do you have any thoughts as to how it makes you feel if the government just doesn't give a shit? My words.
I mean, I do think that the posture of the federal government towards these policies and the enforcement that's going on and the public's reaction to it is quite different than what we've seen in the past, because they don't seem to be attempting to minimize or cover up or hide a lot of the most scary things that are going on. So they're not telling us that children are not being held. It's almost as if part of the enforcement is letting it be known that children and families are being held, and these are the conditions that they're being held in, and they're not being released, and a lot of people are choosing to leave, and that's maybe almost part of the enforcement. And I mean, that's me speculating, of course, but it's causing a great amount of fear and distress in immigrant communities, and I would imagine that, I mean, to me, that just feels like it's part of the enforcement strategy.
Well, I would just say that I think one thing I've thought a lot about as a journalist is just what you're saying. The administration has been making their own videos, not necessarily of Dilley, but of enforcement more broadly, and sort of advertising some of these actions. And I think a question that I don't know an answer to, that I ask as a journalist, is it of the administration's interest for these things that are happening to people to be broadly broadcast as warnings? Is that useful to them? Or does it serve as something that would shame them to change their behaviors? And I think, and depending on those two answers, how does that change how we behave as a journalist? And I don't know. I don't know what's inside their minds. I don't know what their motivations are. And I don't know what this changes for us for how we work as journalists. But it's a question I've been asking myself a lot as we do this reporting and as we watch how the government shares its own images of what happens and how the government responds to us when we share the information that we found.
if there's no real free society or freedom of the press, if the government's going to do what it wants to do and the laws and the rules be damned, it's very hard to be a journalist in that system. You're talking about an oppressive regime like Russia, where journalists necessarily have to report what the government tells them to report. So I don't know how you do accountability journalism or impact journalism if the government doesn't care what you write. And even to your point, Shannon, what if you're actually feeding the beast by giving them the kind of reporting that they actually want, so people get scared and leave because you're reporting on exactly what they want you to report on? So it's, I don't know. I mean, I can opine about this forever. It's very difficult right now in this climate for you to do this kind of meaningful work. And I would just hope that you don't quit just because the government isn't changing their stripes. I'm assuming if you keep picking away. So that's my last question. And to make sure, Shannon, you get to have the freedom to take care of your family. What's next in your reporting? Is there a new article you guys are working on? Is there something that's you guys have been digging or sinking your teeth into?
Yeah, there's several threads we're chasing right now. We can't get into too much detail about all of them, but I would say we are following up on what we've heard about medical conditions inside and mental health distress of people. We're also very curious about the long tail of what happens to folks after they're released and how those releases are happening and what it's meant for families who are either deported or returned to the interior of the United States. I think in many of these cases, just because the detention is over doesn't mean things are over for them. And we're really curious to learn more about what that means.
Thank you both so much for taking the time and to be so open to the questions. Thank you for listening to The Raid, available wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about our guests and the subjects we cover, please visit our website at theraidpodcast.org.